this project, I began some experimentation. And first of all, I decided to work on some composition to improve some of the angles and coordinations I'll be using for my portraits. Kind of like differentiating from the standard like front facing angle that you get with most portraits. I wanted to kind of be different with like the way I position like the subject and all that. Moving on, I began sketching some like samples as well. Not really having a main subject in mind, just really drawing like my friends and also like myself as well. And I continued this using like graphite, some chalk as well, and basic pencil sketches as well. So at the start of the project, I began mind mapping some potential like medias that I could be using throughout the project. So these consist of like charcoal, graphite, painting, acrylics, etc. Just basically giving me an example what I could use for experimentation and also for like my main ideas and also my outcomes. And then I began deciding different topics that I could study or convey through my artwork. And these consist of like environment, drugs, social status, kind of topics that kind of link in with like environment, social factors, and all that. And then moving on, I eventually decided my theme, and that would be it says here, it'd be personality. So this was going to be my theme for this project. And before that, I went into depth, deciding different topics I could have used, picking out two not main themes from this mind map over here, kind of deciding like some subtopics that I could have used throughout them too. Um, I then went on to do some thematic research, kind of just discussing like what I eventually chose throughout this mind map here. So, moving on to my artist research, I decided to research David Walker, who I've also researched for my last project in Unit 5. But with Unit 5, I didn't really use the whole portrait side of David Walker. Um, the main thing I took with his artwork for my last project was these kind of like strands of colour that you can see in his artwork. Not really like the lining and all the overall aesthetic of his work, really. But with this one, I was intending to kind of use like the lining and also some form of the color scheme and aesthetic that you can see with his work. Moving on to David Hockney, I've also researched him with previous projects as well, mainly because of the noticeable layering process that you can see with his artwork and also like some of the color tones as well. Hockney's kind of been like a really big inspiration for a lot of my artwork, mainly because like it's really noticeable that you can see that he's layered different tones to kind of create like these portraits as well. Moving on, we've got Francis Bacon, and the main thing I've took with Bacon's artwork is this distorted feel that you can see with his portraits. Not so much like the lining of the actual like subject, mainly because or mainly due. Oh, oh my god, So moving on to artists that are completely new to this project and I haven't researched in any previous sort of assignments, we've got Francis Bacon. The main thing with his portraits that you can notice is this distorted feel that you can see, and the noticeable colour scheme as well. Mainly you got like the yellows, the reds, and also like the purple and blues to kind of signify an emotion. And this is the main design choice that I took from Francis Bacon's artwork, and I eventually used this in my actual final outcome for this project. Moving on, we've got Ekaterina Polovania. I think that's how you pronounce it anyway. Anyway, but the main thing about her artwork is her blatant use of oil pastels to kind of create this. Next, we got Ekaterina Polovania. I think that's how you pronounce it anyway. And what I took from her designs is her use of oil pastels and the way she kind of blends colours into one another. It's kind of you can kind of see here. She's got some yellow and like this kind of shade of like brown or red or something, and it's kind of giving off like some form of emotion with like a different color scheme instead of like the usual like beige color that you get with like realistic like portraits. Also here we've got Andreas Gruta, who is actually an Instagram creator who creates portraits. Next, we have Andreas Gruta, and with his artwork, and his use of acrylics, they kind of create this really smooth blend of different colours, which I found really interesting and I wanted to really use in my ideas. And I eventually decided to use acrylics for my actual final outcome as well, mainly because how he kind of creates this really smooth like blend into different tones. Found that really like inspiring for my actual ideas and my final. Next up, there's Nilo Wafa, who actually uses watercolor to kind of create these really realistic, well, not really realistic in like the lining. They more have this like animated style, but with like the different shades and like the texture of the actual portraits, they kind of mimic that realism with like shades and also like lighting as well. Next, there's Cody James, who kind of uses like this like scribble to kind of make these realistic portraits as well. He not only does like people, he does like I think there's like all the Muppets here as well, and kind of mixing in like some graffiti as well as some form of symbolism. Which, coming from my last project where I used a lot of street art and graffiti, I wanted to kind of test this out originally to see how it would fit in with this project, but I don't really think I ended up going with it. I did experiment with this style, but I never really added the graffiti in because I wanted to try out something new. And then finally, we have Paul Schaefer, who I think is one of my biggest inspirations for this project, mainly because the overall lighting and also like the shadows that you can see like over the eyes as well. Like before I even started this project, I already knew I think I was going to use Paul Schaefer as an inspiration, mainly because like the realism that you can see with his artwork and also like just the overall like texture. I really wanted to kind of replicate this and use this as a reference for my ideas with this project. So while I was creating my ideas for this project, I stumbled upon Grayson Perry, who was an artist that I studied briefly for my Unit 2 project where I experimented with 3D and 4D designs. So usually Grayson Perry works with pottery and kind of creates these like tapestries onto like these like jars and vases or something like that. The main thing I took with Grayson Perry's ideas is this use of the tapestry that he kind of uses, where he shows like these different portraits showing like different stages in someone's life, really, and adding like forms of symbolism that cater to their personality, which was an interesting idea that I did take from his artwork and I did use in a couple of my ideas, though very briefly. I didn't really take this much like further into like the refinement stage. Usually kept it with like my starting ideas. So moving back to my practical work, here I decided to create some samples using acrylics, which was at this point I knew I was probably going to use acrylics for my final outcome, as I wanted to kind of like learn the material throughout the project. And at this point, I didn't really have a main subject in mind. I was kind of just experimenting with just different people, really. So just got some like my peers, my friends, and just kind of like understanding the human form, really, to kind of like create portraiture without using a reference, really. As you can see with this one here, which I just kind of like I thought really just like using like my own mind really to kind of create like a realistic portrait without using any like reference imagery. All of these are from like primary imagery as well. As with primary, I kind of wanted to learn it to kind of like improve my skills using primary imagery. As with all of my portraits before this stage, I use secondary imagery. And overall, I really hated all these designs. Like, this was at a point where I was still learning, so obviously they weren't going to be perfect. But I feel even with that in mind, I feel like I could have done so much better with these. They feel just really rushed, and also I know you can't really notice it here, or you can't really notice it much, but there's actually like small cracks in the actual portrait, which was also like a really big issue going into primary. Moving on, got some refined practices. At this point, I was thinking like whether I should. Oh yeah, we restarted. So moving on to my refinements for these samples, I had this idea in mind where I wanted to draw portraits of characters from like TV shows. So as you can see here, I've drawn Sully from Top Boy and also Jay from The Inbetweeners, with no real clear meaning. This is just kind of like testing out, see what I could do for my ideas and my final, and not really having like a clear subject which could actually convey a strong meaning. And again, with this, I was testing out the acrylics and kind of like progressively improving with them over time, just kind of like bettering my skill set with this material. Here are some plans for like the Grayson Perry tapestry, which was something I did want to take further into my final. But later on, I did actually change and keep it to a more simple standard. Even though like, I found this really interesting, I did actually use it for some of my refinements going forward. Here, I was testing out different like techniques. So here we have charcoal, and I've kind of like created this like blurred effect, which I found pretty interesting at this point. And also with these, I was experimenting with like graphite, for example. One way I one way I found that not only saves time and also allows me to like create so much more like samples, testing out different materials, was to actually like create this like outline for a portrait and fill in like smaller segments with the material that I was using to experiment with. So with this one here, I've used some graphite, and with this one here, I used a bit of stippling with either graphite or charcoal. I don't really remember. And as you can see, like further down here, these are just like really small sketches of like the facial structure and also like different parts of the face, like the eye, for example, using like cross hatching. Moving on, here's my artist inspired designs. So first off, we have Francis Bacon, and I'll be honest, these turned out a complete mess. Don't really know what I was going for here. I really wanted to capture like this distorted feel to kind of convey like the different personalities that someone's feeling on the inside, using like different color schemes to show the different emotions. And with this one here, with the blue, at the time, I used blue to kind of convey like this sense of like peace and like serenity. But through further research, I found that blue often represents like a depressive state or something like that. And with these two designs, these are also kind of continuing like my use of oil pastels, which is something I did use from Unit 4 as my main material for my final. But with the lining of this not having like a real structure, these turned out like a complete mess, really. Moving on to Cody James, like I did use like this scribbling effect, trying to capture that realistic feel that you can see with Cody James's portraits, but with like no like proper like plan for the lining. I simply just went straight forward into it, not really like sketching it out or something. And obviously this turned out completely messy, completely abandoning that realism. Just you know. Then moving on to Needle Wafer's designs. First I did try some watercolor to kind of capture that animated feel, which I did note out. Which was bro. Restarting. Next we have Needle Wafer, whose designs I've used with watercolor to begin with, and then transitioned to using acrylic markers for the second practice. So starting off with the watercolor design, I wanted to kind of capture that realistic texture that you can see with her artwork. And overall, there are some hints to the same like texture that you can see, but the addition of this outline over here, which I kind of intended to replicate this animated feel that I originally noted from her artwork. This didn't really turn out that good in my opinion, really. Like the overall outcome turned out pretty messy with this edition, and looking back, one thing I would improve with this design over here is to kind of keep it like without the outline, having this sort of like realistic aesthetic, which probably would have turned out way better than this. I took this improvement that I should have made with this and reflected it onto this design over here. But another issue that occurred with this design over here is that the lighting didn't really turn out as effective as I thought it would be, and it kind of just like looks like one full color tone instead of just having like this realistic shade and texture that you can see with this. Moving on to this David Hockney inspired idea that I came up with. I did want to capture the realism, which I did actually succeed in with the oil pastels. Oil pastels were a material that I actually used for Unit 4's final outcome, mainly because the realism that you could achieve with the material due to the smudging and also the addition of different colour tones to kind of add to the texture. And overall, this is kind of what I really wanted for my final to be, this kind of like realistic effect with the lining, came into more realism as well. Moving on to Andreas Gutsa. You can barely even tell it was kind of inspired by Gutsa. I kind of see this as a failed attempt, really. I kind of just took my own direction, adding different colour schemes. The one thing that was inspired by Gutsa's work was the use of materials being acrylic markers, and even then, like, you can see streaks. It looks incredibly rushed, and I tried fixing it with adding cross hatching and also like different like pixels. Like you can see like little squares and like dots. And overall, it just turned out a complete mess. Then with Paul Schaefer, with these ideas, I kind of came up with this symbolism of adding like some pixelated effect over here, and also adding the color scheme to kind of convey a personality as well. And also like the shadowing of like the eyes. I later like stated that the shadows kind of reflect like the inner thoughts, like having it like the complete opposite of the outside. And so starting off with my initial ideas, I actually took these two from my artist inspired designs and thought these were well developed enough to kind of be used as an initial idea, as these two over here kind of reflected on what my actual final would probably be like. As you can see with the pixelated design on the side, it's kind of being used to show different thoughts of the person as well, with like the different colors as well. You can see like different tones of blue, kind of like cyan as well, and darker blue as well, to kind of captivate different thoughts and personalities as well. And for this design over here, I wanted to capture this kind of like injury that the subject had on his forehead, which isn't linked to self-harm, but due to ethical reasons, I couldn't really show the actual injury, as it would kind of humiliate the subject, and I wanted to preserve the dignity as well. So instead, I decided to show the link to self-harm through this like pattern on the forehead, really, in no way, shape, or form reflecting the actual injury. With my second idea, this one was actually my first time experimenting with this style of stippling, which is kind of like painting the background a complete black, and also filling out like the different shadows and shades of the face with black as well before going over with the stippling, and also adding like different segments of stippling, which consist of like multiple, to kind of create these different shades where they're more darker as well, kind of gradually getting lighter as they move further away from that point. And the line in here was kind of inspired by Andreas Gutsa, not so much the color scheme, because I wanted to keep my designs more original. So therefore, I only took inspiration from the lining with most of them, only rarely using the color scheme as well with some of my ideas. And here's the original sketch that I made for this design. And after this, I then began experimenting with different materials, kind of creating multiple repetitions of this idea. So here, I again use the symbolism to link to self-harm with this like purple segment of the forehead as well, and adding this little like dripping aesthetic as well. I also wanted to kind of add text into my designs as well. So the backstory with this subject here, this is actually my brother, who is actually non-verbal, and therefore I've used like these. I think I've used tape over here to kind of cover his mouth to signify him being non-verbal, and using text to kind of like describe his personality, as he can't physically tell us what we're actually thinking, what he's actually thinking. So I've used text such as like misunderstood as a way to kind of show that we can't truly know what he's actually thinking inside. We only have like very brief and vague clues such as like the facial expressions, and also like basically like oh my god. So to give a brief backstory on the subject here, this is actually my brother. So my brother is actually non-verbal and severely autistic, and he actually cannot tell us physically what he's actually thinking on the inside. So hence why some of these ideas kind of show text such as misunderstood and also trapped as well, showing that he cannot tell us physically what he's actually thinking or feeling on the inside, leaving him like kind of misunderstood, as like we have to kind of guess what he's feeling as he cannot physically tell us. So we can only tell through like vague or brief clues such as like facial expressions or kind of like brief sounds that he makes, as he's obviously non-verbal and he cannot like tell us what he's actually feeling. So with these repetitions of this one design here, I've kind of went through experimental stage, adding different materials and also different forms of symbolism as well. So first off, we have this idea over here. I've painted the forehead about like this magenta, like purple color, which is also a link to self-harm, which is a concept I explored with this idea over here, and also adding this like black dripping effect to kind of show that his inner thoughts, which are mysterious and unknown, which is why I painted them black. They're kind of leaking onto the outside. This idea I've already explained why, and with this one here, with this like red like form of symbolism, I kind of wanted to like show like the brain, and as you can see, it's kind of got this like square-like shape, which is like this pixelated, which I originally intended to be like this pixelated aesthetic, to kind of reflect like this design over here, and with the addition of like the question marks, which is kind of showing like that his inner thoughts are completely unknown, and that we can possibly never know. Moving on to my third idea, I took a design, my David Hockney inspired idea, and then started to fill in like different segments of the design in actual color to kind of show like these are the few areas that we do know, and the rest is just a complete mystery. Like with the black and white being completely anonymous to us, and with the color being like some parts, very few parts of the person that we actually can understand. And again, this is kind of showing like the inspiration as well. These is from my David Hockney inspired idea. And again, these are just the many, many repetitions that I made of this one design, kind of conveying like different meanings, such as another ah my with my fourth initial idea, I decided to add different colour into the actual portrait to kind of convey the different emotions that he's feeling, adding like small hints of purple to kind of show like this brief feeling of an alternate emotion, with the main colour scheme being blue. And similar to my last idea, I began making multiple repetitions, all adding like different forms of symbolism, such as this brain, which is like two different colours to show all the personalities, like different like strands of colour, with this being inspired by David Walker's work as well, with the multiple colours like dotted around. These being inspired by Francis Bacon, with the distortion and also like the different colours as well, taking up most of the face. This being a hint to being non-verbal and also neurodiversity, with the mouth being closed, as a symbolism that he cannot physically tell us what he's feeling on the inside, and also nods to Cody James's work with the scribbles, all being different colours to show the like diverse personality of the person, and just multiple repetitions. Also, some notable with the puzzle pieces being a symbolism to neurodiversity, and also just experimenting with different techniques, materials. Here I've put in collage as well, adding collage into previous repetitions as well, just kind of working over the original design. So moving on to my final outcome ideas, I painted this portrait. So I did use acrylics for this as I wanted, as at this stage I was 100% sure that I did actually want to take acrylics further into my actual outcome. But with this design in particular, I felt this is not my best representation of acrylics. As I felt with the lining and also like the proportions, they were way off from the actual reference image. But one thing I do want to take from this, but I thought, well, actually, nah. One thing I did find interesting from this, but I don't think I actually took it into my actual final outcome, was the use of this like alternate figure that is situated behind the main subject, containing this pixelated effect which I've used from my previous ideas, kind of like showing an alternate personality that we cannot explore. I then not painted, sketched out this reference image over here, and then just went over with Sharpies, graphite, basic pencil, with cross hatching as well. But the main problem with this is that because I cannot really get primary. Oh my. The main issue with this set of ideas here is that the reference image is actually AI generated. So a workaround that I decided to make, as pretty much it would be completely impossible to get primary imagery of the actual subject because the continuous rocking motion that the person made. I decided to actually create AI generated reference imagery from one actual photo that I did take of the person. And this raised an argument whether it was plagiarism or alternate compositions of an original image. So therefore, I decided to completely abandon the concept of using AI, as it would be considered complete plagiarism. Later on, I decided to revisit acetate. So acetate was something I did use in previous projects, but I didn't actually use it correctly. Like, I remember with Unit 3, I stuck it onto a piece of cardboard in the shape of a puzzle piece for one of my projects. And because I stuck it on with glue, that it created this smudge effect, which just completely looked like an absolute mess, if I'll be honest. And with Unit 4, I used acetate again, mixing it in with this oil pastel design that I created for one of my ideas. And again, I used the same mistake, sticking it in with glue, which also created this smudge. So this time around, I knew how to use acetate, like not really effectively, but had a brief understanding really. And I used a light box here to kind of show like different like forms of emotion using different photographs of the person to kind of show like different personalities, just mixing around, basically just like experimenting with different positions, compositions. And this was like a solid idea that I could use, but never actually used it for my final because later on in my final that I later decided just to keep it completely simple because I was scared of overcomplicating the design. Then finally, we move on to my final outcome. So this is a series of 3 portraits that I've created to show different forms of emotion and personality, also conveying meaning as well. So these are about A0, and I've all been painted onto a wooden canvas to follow with sustainability. So the first portrait over here is in all black and grey, kind of signifying that the inner thoughts and inner mind of the person is kind of leaking onto the outside. Whereas the facial expression is like this smile showing like sort of happiness, whereas inside is the complete opposite, showing kind of like underwhelming, kind of like misery as well. And with the intense eyeshadow, kind of showing like I kind of see the eyes as like a mirror to the inner mind as well, and having it all black kind of shows like the emptiness as well, kind of showing that it's been leaking onto the inside, and the entire portrait is in all black as well. With this design, I was more inspired by Paul Schaefer, more so with the lining and also the eyeshadow as well. Um, the second one I did was this one on the right. I don't know why this isn't the centerpiece, because when I took the photo, I didn't really like organize it properly. But With this one, it takes a more inspired design, as with these other two over here, they more cater to realism more than being like completely in style of an artist. Anyway, with this one here, the main aesthetic here is this purple scar on the right side of the person's face, which is the indicator for self-harm as well. As I've stated before, due to ethical reasons, I can't really show the actual injury of the person to kind of preserve the dignity as well and trying to not humiliate the person. Um, Originally, I was going for a more lighter tone with this design, but um, because I continuously just layer paints to kind of get the tone I really wanted, it turned out this really like this darker like beige color, and because of this, there were segments of the portrait that were darker than the rest. So I used this to my advantage and actually created this kind of like darkish like tone on the top of the portrait as well, which adds to this like dripping effect, which is like another indicator to self harm and also showing like an opposite personality. And also like the neutral expression on the person's face is kind of meant to indicate that form of emotion as well. And then finally, with this portrait over here, this is more inspired by. Hang on, I didn't even like, say what this was inspired by. Hang on. So moving back to this one, this was more inspired by Francis Bacon, as I wanted to create this like distortion on this side of the person's face, kind of in a different color as well, to kind of show that link to self harm and also some form of emotion. Anyway, back to this one. This takes a more realistic approach, being more inspired by David Hockney, as the use of layering that has gone into this as well, using different tones of the color as well. And with this one, the facial expression and also the color show one form of emotion, being like a more positive personality. But as I've learned with a previous idea, the blue actually signifies a form of like a depressive state as well. So I've used the blue to kind of act as a meaning for two emotions, that being happiness and also sadness as well. And with this design, as I've stated before, it was inspired by David Hockney and also a bit of Andreas Gruter with the use of acrylics and me applying some of the tone as well. And here it kind of shows the process, how I've layered it as well, and also how I've got to this texture that is shown in the outcome. Same with this, you can see the lighter tone that I've applied with this design and how it eventually turned out to be a more darker aesthetic. And with this one, it went completely to plan. Really, like I didn't really like create like a lighter tone to begin with. I always wanted this to be like a more muted color scheme. And these are all the ideas that I actually used to inspire this vinyl. With this like dripping, you can see the dripping is noticeable. Like with this portrait over here, you can see it very used. You can see it used briefly. Sorry for the stutter. You can see it used briefly here and gone. And with this, like these patches of red, you can see in that all of that design as well with the purple scar. This like patch of color being used to inspire like the white and blue. Again with the patching as well, the pixelation and all that. And this being a more Paul Schaefer inspired design with the eyeshadows as well, going into like the more muted portrait. And these are just some ideas that I really wanted to take further, but due to me thinking that I was going to overcomplicate the actual outcome, I actually kept it more simple. These were considered, and I did want to actually add after I've created the portraits and kind of going over them. I realized after I've made them that I didn't really want to overcomplicate it or risk actually ruining the portrait, so I just kept it as it is.